program is brought to you in association with First National Bank of Botswana. Alcohol is a big business, and so its positive economic impact cannot and should not be denied. Let us take beer as a premise for our argument. A report released in January 2022 by Oxford Economics found that about $555 billion of 70 countries' GDPs was supported by the global beer sector in 2019, sustaining about 23 million jobs and stimulating around $262 billion in tax receipts. This first-of-its-kind study investigated the beer sector's footprint across these countries, which account for 89% of global beer production, amongst them Botswana. This report shows that the global beer sector supported a whopping $293 million gross value-added impact to Botswana's economy through its domestic and international operations in 2019. All this while sustaining almost 10,000 jobs in the country, equivalent to 3.8% of all employment in Gaborone. In our humble opinion, these statistics prove just how popular alcohol is, and one may contend this has been made so by how the beverage has been packaged to drive sales. For a majority of adverts, alcoholic beverages manufacturers sell alcohol as a good time or an experience, if you will, and not just a drink to chug down. Think about it. Most adverts on print or electronic media about alcohol are either a group of friends celebrating a goal during a football game, young women cheering each other on at a nightclub with a cocktail in hand, or a toast with champagne at some young couple's wedding, and so on and so forth. From just that, the global alcoholic beverages industry is now valued at over $1 trillion as at 2021. While all this is well and good, there's also a downside that must be acknowledged as well. Because alcoholic beverages have been irrefutably ingrained in our society, this presents its fair share of challenges as well, especially on human health. A proven fact about alcohol is that prolonged uncontrolled consumption can lead to severe addiction to the beverage. The effects of this are a plethora of socio-economic consequences that include absenteeism from work, depression, physical violence, and many others. On this back foot, First Issues engaged Dr. Kiran Bhagat to talk about the biopsychosocial history of alcohol so we understand exactly why this substance is addictive and how to deal with the ramifications.
Well, alcohol is a big topic, and I think it's a topic that most people are somewhat aware of, and it's one of what we call cognitive dissonance. Let's start there, which basically means people generally know a bit like what they shouldn't eat, but they still eat it. People know the effects of alcohol, but they still take the alcohol. Alcohol has been around for thousands of years. I mean, the earliest history is documented by the Chinese and the Egyptians almost 3,000 years ago, found in the pyramids in containers and vaults, which were brews that were taken that time. But in very simple terms, alcohol is a product of fermentation. It is where yeast, together with whether it's fruit or whether it's grains or whether it's vegetables, ferment. The yeast ferments the particular compound in question, producing alcohol together with carbon dioxide. And as you evaporate the carbon dioxide, what you're left with is alcohol. Distilled alcohol, which basically is like your malts, your whiskey and your vodkas, is where you remove more and more of the water. So you distill the alcohol, it becomes more concentrated. So that basically, in a biological ways how alcohol is produced. And of course, everybody knows that each culture has their own favorite form of fermentation, whether it's in China and Japan, they ferment rice. In some parts it's potatoes, and in our parts of the world it's usually grains like barley and wheat to produce beer and some of the heavier spirits. So this is what alcohol is and how it's manufactured. And over the course of thousands of years, it has been used for lots of purposes. It's been used in a religious perspective, in the Catholic Church, the wine and the bread as a sacrament. It's been used for ritual purposes. And of course, in a modern context, it's used, I guess, as a social lubricant. It allows people to wind down and sort of chill out for a while. Everybody knows who has taken alcohol or has observed somebody taking alcohol, how they loosen up or they de-stress. So that basically is what alcohol is.
How does it work on the body? And perhaps you could talk about the effect it has on the body and the brain.
Well, alcohol is a very simple molecule. It is very easily permeable, which basically means it crosses all the tissues of the body very, very quickly. So the moment you ingest it, it actually crosses the intestine or the gut and gets straight into the bloodstream. It doesn't need to be digested or broken down, which is why I think within literally 15 to 20 minutes of a glass of wine or a beer or some whiskey, the effects are seen in the brain, because it actually gets through the blood-brain barrier, which is usually a very tight barrier for evolutionary perspective, but it's very easy to cross into all the tissue membranes, which is why also it has some of the consequences adversely in a long-term basis. What it does initially is once it's crossed from the gut into the circulation in the blood and then gets into the brain, it is a depressant. It's what we call a psychoactive compound. In other words, it is active on the psychology of the brain. And everybody who's seen somebody take alcohol or has taken alcohol themselves notices one of two things. Initially, there's what we call a disinhibition. You feel a little bit more relaxed in saying what you want to say, talking about the problems that you have at home or discussing the problems that you have. I guess the best word is you sort of chill out, and you become a little bit more sociable, a little less stressed. However, everybody knows also that the more you drink, it has what's called a paradoxical effect. In other words, initially things are a little bit more lively and a little bit more relaxed, but one of two ways can occur in terms of people who consume alcohol. Some become depressed and also withdrawn, or they become very quiet, and the others become hyperactive, or they become rude, they become abusive, they become violent, and sometimes they can have the acute injury effects of alcohol. So it has a gradient where initially it does sort of calm people down, which is why people like to take it in our stressful society. But one must be aware of the sort of progression that occurs with everybody in terms of alcohol. It's important to remember also that to remove alcohol is actually not as quick as people think. There are particularly young men feel that they can actually down, several pints of beer or a couple of glasses plus of wine and get away with it. But one glass of wine or one portion of whatever alcohol you're drinking takes about an hour to actually break down in terms of the liver. And the liver breaks down alcohol into a compound called acetaldehyde. Acetaldehyde is the immediate metabolite or breakdown product, and this is the product that actually begins to cause lots of complications in the body. It causes cancer, it causes ulcers, it causes lots of things. So one needs to understand that this is an issue that occurs. And in that context, it's important to understand that in the 21st century, the alcohol industry has been particularly powerful, very much like the tobacco industry, in finding ingenious ways for you to consume more alcohol. And one needs to talk about it in the context of social media, your Instagram, your Facebook, the websites, as well as the advertising that occurs to try and encourage you or encourage the public to take this alcohol. So it's important to understand that this alcohol effect is immediate. It takes its effect over a gradual period of time. And you can even, if you are a teetotaler who doesn't drink, you can actually see your friends change by observing as the night draws on how their characters and personalities change.
What are the possible long-term effects that you could speak to of mild, moderate, and maybe heavy use of alcohol?
Well, I think if we talk about the short-term and the long-term effects, short-term, the effects can be large, and the World Health Organization estimates between 3 to 4 million people per annum worldwide suffer the consequences of either death or complications from alcohol. And the immediate effects are those that everybody knows. It's physically abusive, it could be sexually abusive, it could be falls. You could be falling down in a drunken state if you've taken too much. Violence in terms of within the context of a pub or in the family or at a workplace. If you've intoxicated yourself, intoxication basically means where you've taken so much where you are actually not able to function in a normal way. You may inhibit some of the centers in the brain, for example, your breathing center. You may vomit, and you may actually bring in that vomit into your lungs, causing pneumonia. You may go into a coma where you actually stop breathing because you had so much alcohol, because it stops the breathing apparatus in the brain. So these are the acute effects that everybody knows. Of course, the long-term effects are very severe, but you can imagine, depending on the policies of the country, the drink and drive issues, the accidents, not only personally, but also on the road, whether they're pedestrians or in a vehicle. So road traffic accidents are the acute effects of alcohol. One also has to talk about the effects of alcohol in terms of consuming other products. Particularly with the younger generation, you may not only take alcohol, but you may take tobacco, you may take some of the other injurious compounds together with tobacco. I know many patients who say that they only take their cigarette when they're drinking a glass of alcohol. So one has to think about the compound effects of that alcohol on an acute effect. So in terms of the long-term effects, let's just look at the body itself. In terms of the body, we have this entire structure. So the moment the alcohol is consumed, alcohol itself is toxic in a single drink or in multiple drinks. So you can actually get mouth ulcers, you can get mouth cancer. As the alcohol is taken down into the stomach, the esophagus, which is the gullet, can actually cause inflammation, irritation, particularly if it's high concentrations of alcohol. We were talking about the spirits, the higher the spirits, it can actually burn the gullet and can cause bleeding, can cause ulcers, and eventually can cause cancer of the stomach. And of course, the biggest issue we have in our country as well as worldwide is because alcohol, the factory that breaks down the alcohol is the liver. And that liver breaks down the alcohol into that compound called acetaldehyde. Acetaldehyde is the compound that causes inflammation of the liver, and that's called cirrhosis. And we see that in our country in growing numbers because of the increasing consumption of alcohol. And we're no exception to the worldwide pandemic of liver cirrhosis and inflammation. Now, one must remember that the liver is a very hardy organ. It's the factory of the body that detoxes the system. But if you actually toxify the organ that detoxifies, all the waste products remain in the system and can cause problems in terms of liver failure. In terms of the gut, as the alcohol goes down into the intestine, you can get ulceration, you can get inflammation, you can get cancer of the bowel, you can get cancer of the lungs, and you can get cancer of the breast in women from consuming regular large amounts of alcohol. So that's all the complications of alcohol in a nutshell. We haven't talked about the brain, because remember, the blood-brain barrier is a very tight barrier, but the alcohol is able to pass through into the brain and can begin to shrink the brain. So we see people who develop eventually with long-term use of high concentrations of alcohol, dementia. So they start to forget things. It particularly affects the memory center. We call it Wernicke's encephalopathy, which is the person who discovered it, where they actually forget things very quickly. And that's because parts of the memory center begin to shrink. And of course, if you have alcohol in large concentrations and you frequently fall, we often see in brains of alcoholics, they've fallen and they've actually bled into the brain. So you can get blood in the brain without knowing it, and people suddenly become drowsy, and we forget that it's actually an old bleed into the brain that's caused the effects of the alcohol. So these are the long-term biological consequences of alcohol.
Let's talk about alcohol addiction. Being dependent on it and the symptoms that one might get if they don't get a fix.
There are different types of reliance on alcohol. There's one of dependency and there's one of addiction. And one can begin to analyze or ask questions, certainly in a clinic, to distinguish whether somebody has dependency or addiction to alcohol. And the classic signs are those where you cannot function without having a glass of wine or a couple of cans of beer. You begin to get tremulous, you begin to shake, you begin to have withdrawal symptoms where you get irritable. You may even vomit, you may get panic attacks. because you're getting a withdrawal symptom in terms of the lack of alcohol in your bloodstream. When it begins to impinge and affect your social relations within a family, for example, you would rather spend the money on alcohol rather than food. You'd rather sacrifice a couple of hours of work and take alcohol instead, take the time off. So your social, if it's beginning to impact on your day-to-day activities, whether it's your social life, whether it's your work life, whether it's your family life, and the fact that you get home and the first thing you need to do is to look for a glass of wine or a bottle of beer, those are signs of dependency and withdrawal symptoms. And if you have those symptoms where you rush to the fridge to open a can of beer, or you need to have that glass of wine to calm down, those are signs that the body is becoming dependent and reliant on alcohol. And then, of course, there's withdrawal. If you can't get it, you don't have enough money, or you're in a situation where you can't drink alcohol because you're in a workplace. You then begin to become irritable, withdrawn, and tremulous and shaky. We call them the shakes. We call it delirium tremens, which is the Greek word for you start getting shaky, and you actually have to hospitalize the patient to manage that withdrawal in terms of the medical complications. So that's dependency and alcohol intoxication, if you like.
Medically, is there a cure for this kind of addiction?
That's a big question, Ponaseko, and I think in terms of dependency and alcohol reliance, there are a multiple number of preventative mechanisms as well as treatments. I think the first thing to say with respect to that is for the individual or the family to recognize that the individual themselves are addicted or dependent on alcohol, and often it's an initial phase of denial. Often we see patients who are alcoholic who deny that they are reliant on alcohol, that they are dependent on alcohol, and that it is affecting their day-to-day relationship with their colleagues or their family or society at large. And so I think the first thing for treatment, and the classic one is Alcoholics Anonymous. The first thing is to go to that center, and we have one in Botswana, where you actually admit that you are an alcoholic. And I think that is the first treatment of choice, because often we try and send our patients to a therapy or an addiction center, but they refuse because they don't think that they are addicted. So the first port of call in terms of treatment is to recognize that I am an alcoholic. And many alcoholics who stop drinking will still call themselves an alcoholic to remind themselves not to drink again, because it just takes one drink after many years of not taking alcohol to become an alcoholic again. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, of course, out of sight, out of mind. And initially, what we say is, if you are showing signs of dependency or addiction, is to not buy the alcohol, because if it's in the house, you'll find it. It's a bit like sugar and some of the bad things we've talked about before. If you don't put it in your shopping basket, you can't have it at home. And the third, perhaps the most important thing, is one that transcends the individual, and we apply it in terms of the social, cultural, and political means of prevention and treatment of alcohol. One is recognition, and of course centers within our public and private sectors which deal with alcohol. So there are physicians that actually can manage substance abuse, whether it's tobacco, whether it's marijuana, and whether it's alcohol, in a certain manner. And we use hospitals like Sabrana to admit patients, section them sometimes to say, we need to actually keep you dry for a while, because they will find ways outside of an institution to get alcohol. And we all know the situation where they'll sell goods and they'll sell their belongings to buy alcohol because they're so addicted. So it becomes that severe. In terms of medical complications, you can imagine that it's a whole plethora of treatments. Where if it's an ulcer, we'll have to give anti-ulcer medication. If it's a bleed in the brain, we have to remove the blood from the brain. If it's a cancer, we need to send them to a cancer specialist. If it's liver failure, we need to start thinking of a liver specialist. Sometimes, in some situations, in some parts of the world, not in Botswana, a liver transplant, which is only given if the individual shows signs of remorse and not going back to the alcohol, because liver transplantation is an expensive tool. In terms of the brain implications, you can damage the nerves of your hands and feet, so you get numbness and tingling in the feet and the hands. So those require vitamin supplementation. Many alcoholics sacrifice good nutrition for their alcohol, so they often are malnourished. So we start by nourishing them better, giving them vitamins, addressing some some of the complications that have occurred in the body of alcohol, and of course then the psychological issues, which can be large. The psychological scars of alcohol addiction often are prolonged and occur long after the physical effects have been managed. So those are issues. In terms of the societal and public health policies, one needs to talk about, the taxation on alcohol, the limitation of alcohol below a certain age group, the advertising of alcohol. Increasingly the alcohol industry has become famous or infamous of finding ways to encourage particularly our young population to take alcohol. You just have to look at some of the adverts that are targeted at particular elements of society, people having a good time, people, enjoying a glass of cold beer or whatever it is. It's sort of culturally appealing to older teenage groups, younger, 20s and university students. And so it seemed to be hip to take that alcohol. And so that's the way the industry has actually led the increase in alcohol consumption. One also has to look at advertising, the way the public sector is exposed to advertising, whether it's on social media, Instagram, Facebook, television, in terms of how we are aware that there's a direct relationship between teenage drinking and exposure to public advertising in terms of alcohol brands. We're also aware that initially, many years ago, there was a gender bias where men drank more, or young men drank more than women, but increasingly the alcohol industry has cottoned on to the fact that if you sweeten the alcohol beverage so that you can actually hide the alcohol in it, these fancy colored drinks that contain alcohol but they look sort of strawberry and raspberry flavored to encourage young women to drink, has also been a mechanism to unfortunately cause a dependency and addiction amongst women, and in certain parts of the world where women and men now drink almost the same amount. One also has to look at the socioeconomic costs. The poorer the population, the more the effects of the alcohol, because people will buy alcohol that's high in concentration, illicitly brewed and not regulated. So these are all the things that needs to be taken into context in terms of transcending the individual and the family and talk about it as society at large.
This program was brought to you in association with First National Bank of Botswana.